Hello and welcome to Journalist Hangout UK, the show where we discuss issues both African and worldwide which are affecting the continent. And we look at how those issues are seen at home and in the African diaspora. I'm Vuyiswa Ngqobongwana, and I'm pleased to welcome our panel today, Temitope Olodo, a preventive terrorism strategist and author, Thamsanqa Zhou, a journalist and broadcaster, and Juliana Olayinka, journalist and broadcaster. Thank you all for joining us today. Oh, security in Africa, a big, big question. But for a lot of people, we hear the word Temitope,
yes,
terrorism being bandied everywhere. But let's be clear what we are defining as terrorism.
Yeah.
What's your take on it?
The concept of terrorism is quite fluid. But terrorism is when you create terror in the hearts of people. It doesn't really mean that the act has happened. But when people, a particular group of people are in fear, then terrorism is actually in operation.
Right, right. What's your feeling, Tam?
Well, it can be defined in different ways. When you hear the word terrorism these days, it's something that is political. It's something where people believe there is something that is being done against the national interest of a particular country. And it has turned more military than it used to be. But of course, there's economic, like what Donald Trump, he's using legislation where they say the American interest is under attack to put tariffs on even the EU, Canada, and China. So you can define it differently, but most people on the streets will understand it to mean somebody who is out there to kill you for political reasons.
Right, and usually having some kind of ammunition. Juliana, what's your feeling on the word?
Well, I'd be echoing much of what my panellists have said, but I would also add that, to me, I would see terror as an ideology. It's not something you can pinpoint. You're fighting against those who are not willing to compromise. And I think that's where the terror comes in, because you don't know where it's coming from, you don't know how to stop it. And that's what I would add to the definition.
Right, right. Well, it seems that when people talk about security and feeling a need to have more ammunition or bring in the army and more involvement of that type, they seem pretty clear about what they're defining as terrorism. But so let's have a quick sweep throughout the whole continent in this first half, starting in Nigeria. We had that Democracy Day address by the wonderful president getting ready for an election. Do you think it's just electioneering, or do you feel for him that the Boko Haram security threat is something that really will be an Achilles heel? Do you agree, Temitope, that for him, Boko Haram's capacity has been degraded?
I do not agree for once that Boko Haram has been technically defeated as being propagated by our president. The challenge we have is that as a former civil servant and as somebody that works in this field, there are certain indexes that I use to define whether terrorism has been defeated or reduced. You have to look at the Global Peace Index, the Terrorism Global Index, and none of those have been reduced. In terms of our spending on terrorism, we are spending on terrorism, but some of the things that we're acquiring are not going to even be available in terms of equipment until 2020. So how then do you define how you're fighting terrorism? Taking into consideration that the cost of violence to Nigeria economy is over 10 billion. So terrorism is, or violence extremism is increasing. As you're quenching one crisis, another one is erupting in other parts of the country.
Well, talking about Nigeria, as a fellow Nigerian there, Juliana, do you agree with your president that he seems to have a handle on this Boko Haram situation, or do you think he's avoiding dealing with the roots causes of the issue?
I don't think Buhari is avoiding dealing with them. He may be avoiding talking about them, as most politicians do. They avoid, don't they? But if we're talking about terror, we're talking about Nigeria, it's not just Boko Haram. We also have the problem with herdsmen, and that has a tone of religious warfare to it. We've got what's going on in the south with the Niger Delta militants. We also have rising in Biafra, which is taking place, and then we haven't even touched upon poverty and
all the underlying social issues.
There are so many different issues, and I think that's the crux and the problem with Nigeria at the moment. It's not just Boko Haram. And once you allow other serious issues to, go undiscussed, you then have people rising up and causing terror.
Absolutely.
Through the fact that, the government are avoiding issues that are affecting them.
Right.
It's a vicious cycle.
Well, talking about a vicious cycle, a very, very threatening aspect of what's evolving in North Africa is the Sahel region, and how that now is becoming really a militarized zone. It's a vast area of our continent. Are you concerned, as some analysts are, Thamsanqa, that the Western world, particularly America, is using the Sahel as its new frontier in its purported war against terrorism?
I'm not concerned about that. The bigger concern is that Africa is not having the ability to solve its own security problems.
True.
And in the Sahel in particular, there are different problems similar to what Juliana is actually describing, the historical ones, pre-colonial times, how people used to live. So there are so many people, millions of people in Africa who aspire to a world that is divided into the kingdoms and the borders that were there before. And what is happening is they feel that they are trapped into political marriages where their rights are not observed, their needs are not met, which is what we saw in Mali with people going all the way to Timbuktu. And what then that does, it dismantles the security forces within the countries and creates a void where the terrorist groups will then come and embed and germinate and start
Understood.
fighting.
But in the name of defending the beleaguered populations that are suffering under this, the United Nations is creating this really strong armed bastion in that area. I mean, it's African soldiers volunteering to be part of this UN force. Are we basically getting set to watch an endless war?
There's no doubt, and there's a lot of politics that's being played. We have the multinational task force, we have the J5, and these different regional armed groups, of course legitimate ones, are conflicting among themselves.
We're talking about vast amounts of money here. Wasn't the American amount being offered to Buhari over 600 million?
It is, and the challenge I have is that, like for the president of Nigeria, for example, one of the things he should have been doing, which he has not done, is that he should have been actively involved in the practical solutions for Mali and Libya, because those are the routes which you will agree the weapons are coming in into Nigeria. So if you concentrate on your country and you concentrate on tackling issues and you're saying, oh, I'm keeping my house safe, but the door is open, I don't see how you could keep your house safe that way.
Right.
Impossible.
Well, do you feel your house is safe, i.e. Nigeria?
No, I don't feel it's safe, and unfortunately we've seen, especially in Nigeria and across the continent, there's just no trust of soldiers. We've all seen the videos emerging of judiciary killings, alleged shootings of populations. It can be very personal. Even our own security men who were tasked to look after us, people are not trusting them. So there's a lot of context to this and a lot that's going on, and there are many things we need to do to solve it.
But what you were saying, Thamsanqa, summarizes basically the dynamic not just of Nigeria and the Sahel, but from Cairo to the Cape, essentially. So now when we look, let's move to South Sudan. That tragic event ongoing perennially in the heart of Africa. Would you not say that was the prime example of how you keep a neo-colonial state destabilized for particular advantage?
In a way, and it creates a problem because Kwame Nkrumah and friends decided that the borders of Africa post-colonial times should not be changed. Probably that needs to be revisited. But of course, that example in that Sudan was then split and you had South Sudan. And the problems in South Sudan then became ethnic because Riek Machar would have said he was part of the presidency. He was a running mate, and he's got the new and President Salva Kiir. So there was a disagreement between the two of them, and both of them believed that they were right. But I want to take it further and say we are now living in a world where we have social media and technology, and Africa is catching up. The problem that happened in South Sudan, the latest conflict that came after that unity government, was merely a social media fake news story, where Riek Machar was actually sitting down with Salva Kiir, and somebody sent out a Facebook message that Riek Machar was under attack.
Okay.
And what happened? His forces would not have allowed that because they were outside. That created that atmosphere that we have now. So there's a need for an overhaul of the intelligence services within Africa. They need to have the right information. They need to advise
their
the
own
government.
intelligence, not from the Israelis,
Well,
which
that's
we
the
saw in the
problem.
African Union.
But very, very briefly, how do you assess what's going on? Look in Tanzania, for example, 10 people were beheaded by so-called Islamists last weekend. This whole thing seems to be conflated around, are you Muslim or not? Are you ISIS or not?
And I think that is what is penetrating Africa at the moment, and that's where I've got serious challenge.
Let me stop you there on that challenge. We'll carry on more, but we have to take a quick break for now. We do have a lot to discuss, as you can hear, so please join us in a few moments. Hello and a warm welcome back to Journalist Hangout UK. I'm Vuyiswa Ngqobongwana, and I'm pleased to welcome back our panel, Temitope Olodo, Thamsanqa Zhou, and Juliana Olayinka. Thank you all. Security, security, security. Africa's certainly not feeling it. And Thamsanqa, as we end our sweep on the continent, we're looking at KwaZulu-Natal. Some analysts are fearing and talking in very dramatic terms about a Wild West scenario where it's a free-for-all.
Probably not. Of course, Zululand is home, so to speak, when you talk about the forefathers having settled and lived there. Now, the problem is never going to be what it was in the early 90s. And most people probably will talk about Nelson Mandela in the manner he's been portrayed with the narrative from the West. For people like me and others in the Southern African region, it is his role, together with people like Jacob Zuma, to be fair, who controlled that clash between the Zulu, and the Xhosa, and any other tribes that were caught in between. So it will never go back there. Of course, the Zulus, we have got a king, there's a structure to control things. So I believe there's still that possibility, but the government needs to be very, very careful. You've got a president who is neither Zulu or Xhosa for the first time in South Africa. And that they need to be very, very careful.
And do you think there's an element of bitter feeling about how Zuma has been treated? That's his home base.
Yeah, there's no doubt that is actually going to continue being the case. But the fact that Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma is there are other people that are there, Mabuza is there, so there's still a feeling that they can continue to be part and parcel of the leadership. Plus, you know, the fact that South Africa has a devolved structure does help, which is the case in Nigeria and other areas. So if that hadn't been the case, the situation in KwaZulu-Natal will be exploding, but it will not, I think, go back to what happened in the early 90s after the death of Chris Hani.
It's a different dynamic, but also getting closer to the dynamic, Juliana, that is occurring in Nigeria, which everyone seems to be avoiding, this big white elephant. Why can't we look at the root causes of that, what is causing the issues we're dealing with now? Because Buhari took advantage of the Democracy Day focus. Let's look at the word democracy, right? And with regard to Nigeria, do you feel that the security dynamic at play there is actually threatening any seriously meaningful definition or application of democracy?
I think, of course, it does, and not just in Nigeria. I think across the continent, because, you know, there are many different drivers that cause security issues. But I think one of the big ones, and I think one that the West don't help and can propel on the continent, is the grey area in government, and that's corruption. And I think where there are waves of poverty, and you know that the gap between the rich and the poor is growing. You know, I know people, you would know Temitope, and I'm sure we all do, you go back home and they're saying it's worse. There was a time they were saying it's better, but now it's like, God, it's so expensive. You go back there, people are avoiding calls from back home because they just can't afford to keep their families. And I think the problem with that gap, and which can and usually is because of corruption, is that people in poorer areas don't understand democracy. They don't. They're very illiterate, and they're easily bribed.
Sure.
You know, you have people coming in with bags of rice, buying their votes, and so security and democracy work hand in hand. But it does come through corruption and through government.
Absolutely. So
We
well,
need good governance. That's what we need.
Exactly.
Right, good governance cannot happen without tackling corruption. Do you really feel, Temitope, that if we actually focus on security being the major issue, we're actually missing the boat?
It's a two-edged sword, because if you ignore security in whichever form or format, you still have some challenges, because if you look at...
But it seems that they couldn't ignore security. It's the very fact that Boko Haram created world headlines that forced the government to make security a top agenda.
Bring back our girls.
Yeah, bring back our girls.
And
Where
even
are
if,
they?
if you go to the Biafra challenge that we have in the southeast, you know, and the way the governance or the handling of that issue is part of the headache for the president. And when you talk about democracy now, those people feel they've been excluded from government, you know, and then you look at this Zakzaki, you know, who is a Shiite in the north, who the court has continuously and repeatedly say, release this individual, and he's not being released, you know, and then you have the Fulani Herdsmen challenge, where, you know, they say declare this this particular group as terrorists, and he refused to do it.
Yeah.
And then when you play politics on those kind of issues, you are definitely going to have challenges.
But what do you think, Thamsanqa, it will take for, well, the whole thing to implode so that the real issues can actually start to be tackled? Because if they manage to cover this with more militarization, it's just a very heavy band-aid that will eventually peel off, surely.
Well, Africa has learned lessons. The generations, this generation of politicians that are coming in understands what it means to respect human rights, They are not going to rush into the use of the military against people with an ideology. Lessons were learned with the Boko Haram issue. Initially, with the Yusuf thing, it could have been dealt with. It could have been nipped in the bud.
With Nigeria, lessons were learned in Biafra.
Yeah, the way that it
was
was
the
then
biggest lesson
handled.
for them.
So it's the same thing with what is happening in the southeast. The government has to be careful that they don't inflame the whole issue. So you can go to any country together. I mean, what happened in Kenya? It could have easily gone quite serious, but the way that President Uhuru and, to his credit, Odinga have dealt with that means the country is coming back together. So there has to be, in Zimbabwe, for instance, the Kukurahundi massacres in the early 80s, people have to learn that you cannot claim that there's a security threat and then use the military and commit a genocide and then hope to bring the country together. So that has to be balanced as Africa goes forward.
But let's look again at the heart of Africa, you know, with the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the tragedy that's been ongoing and seemingly unsolvable. But what it's doing is it's helping us to focus, I guess, our attention in a broader way at the whole continent in a joined up way. And I'm really glad the way the discussion is going in making those links. Yes. Now we look at DRC and the issue of displacement. You know, the borders are becoming meaningless now as people move across borders to be safe.
I think if we look at the DRC, and I have kind of studied it a little bit, and it should be not just Africa's wealthiest country, the world's. Yes. With the unlimited resources of minerals that they have there. But going back to what I said, and this is definitely in the case of DRC propelled by the West, it's the fact that we are not looking after the minerals. Corruption is huge because, of course, you know, only a certain amount of the population are getting a piece of that wealth, leaving others to say, hang on a minute, where is mine? They gather together to try and fight back. And then, of course, we have child labour, slavery, people going to the mines, you know, doing all sorts of work to try and get a little bit of piece of the pie, which they can't get their hands on. And I think...
No wonder they're called blood diamonds.
Of course, exactly. And I think this is an area where the West turn their back on Africa and say, we don't give a damn what the governments are doing, as long as we get a piece of pie. But that, to me, is the catalyst for the security issues because of the problems with the wealth gap.
But you see, the issue of displacement, and let's look at African-orientated solutions. And, you know, we've got the African Union, we've got ideals of Pan-Africanism, but we haven't been able to make them take root and be practical. Isn't this an opportunity, the sort of negation of borders, okay, under distress, for us to actually start discussing more cooperative links among African governments to help each other? Do you think there's any hope for that? Or is the legacy of neocolonialism keeping us so distracted with problems at home, we don't have a chance of working well together?
There is a big challenge. 12% of trading, just 12% of trading within Africa itself. There's a lip service at the top there, and they're always backing themselves. The leaders are very good in backing themselves. You know, although there've been some changes, because we saw what happened in Gambia and the fact that Nigeria got involved, and we see that they send peace, convoys around now, because I think they're recognizing, just like my panelist said, that there is need to change. Even though they're talking about, we're not seeing military coups the way we used to see it in the past, but they're still using the military. Nigerian governor, president, for example, and I will use Nigeria as an example, once said when he was asked, can't the police investigate the military? And he looked straight into the camera and he said, no. The military cannot be investigated by the police. Okay, well, let's talk about need to be strong. And that's the challenge we have.
The worry about militarization as well. It looks like the situation in South Africa, the biggest security force arising are the private security companies run by ex-Boer policemen, effectively, which are really taking charge of the well-being of our, allegedly well-being of our people.
Every country that becomes that changes, especially gets rid of the people that were in the military. Those people will then find other places. Same thing as in Zimbabwe, most of them were around the world.
I'm so sorry, Thamsanqa, to interrupt you at that crucial point, but it's obviously an ongoing discussion. Don't forget to follow us at RealJH UK on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. I'm Vuyiswa Ngqobongwana, and from the entire knowledgeable team here in London, it's goodbye to you, and thank you so much for watching JH UK.